Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
ma'am. Yeah, thank you, Chair Nathanson and Vice Chair Reski and members of the committee. Today we bring before you House Bill 4141. Where this ultimately came was,
Just remember to say your name first.
yeah, my name is James Hieb, represent House District 51. But this came about because of a couple conversations that I had with a few retirees, and then something I heard in one of the revenue committees, and hearing about the CAFA funds, which the county assessors function funding assistance account. And so what this bill does is I'll start with what it doesn't do. It doesn't reduce property taxes. What it does is for people that can't pay their property taxes, it would or bring down the interest rate, because right now the monthly rate is 1 1/3%, which, on an APR or an annual basis, that sounds fine, but on a monthly basis, it winds up equating to a 17.2% APR. It's so for somebody that is elderly, not working anymore, they're either going to have to defer their taxes and then, take them out of their estate, and that stops that generational wealth, because their kids will then either have to sell the property or sell assets to pay that off. There was a gentleman that I talked to, it's like, he was worried about that. He's like, hey, I keep just barely making it, or if he said he's like a little bit late, and he had, it was like $500 extra for being a few days late, and then sent off his check, and then they're like, oh, wait, you didn't quite get the whole amount. And he was just explaining how much of a nightmare it was for him. And it just seems to me like, to count on the revenue of people that aren't being able to pay their bills it just seems backwards to me. It seems like we're putting an undue burden on somebody that already can't pay their mortgage payment. And typically it only would apply to somebody that owns their own property. So typically somebody that's worked their whole life and is now retired. And it just doesn't seem quite right to me. And these funds, I know there's been a few concerns brought up to me, but these funds, they're used to fund county tax surveyors, but it doesn't go straight to the counties. It kind of goes back to the state, and then it's split up 25% to the county taxes. There's so many acronyms. It's like a tax assessor network fund, or TANF, and then the other 25% goes to somebody else. Another 10% goes to administration. And it's really hard to follow. It's kind of broken funding stream for the FAFA accounts. And right now I'm trying to get some tax relief or tax interest relief for these citizens, and possibly start the conversation about what would be a better function of funding the tax assessors.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Boquist.
Brian Boquist, Senate District 12. See, I did it right off the bat. The good representative, of course, I mean, as all bills do, shops bills around and says, here's an issue, I'm looking at this. And I don't know whether it was the second I saw the email or it was just the back of the brain being beaten to daylights on the lack of housing in the state of Oregon, and, we're going to raid the rainy day fund deposit because we need money for housing. But housing is the top of the issue, and it doesn't matter whether you're in my district where there's no affordable housing and there's no housing that millennials, as I talked about yesterday in the revenue forecasts, they're working 3 jobs, can afford it, or whether you're in the opposite position, which is both lucky and unlucky with certain members of this committee, where they have so many new jobs being created, but they're in a depressed white zone, by the way, okay? They're in this depressed area from yesterday, but they have so many jobs, but there's not enough housing to fill that. And housing is a complex issue. And what we don't do is we almost never, in the 20 years I've been here, try to address the actual problem. We go after these symptoms. And this is another component of housing. And property taxes started long, long ago in the state of Oregon. And what most people don't know is contrary to Hollywood, and they used to teach this in the public schools I was in, which was false too, is during the Great Depression, the evil bankers foreclosed on everybody. And the evil bankers came out and took their houses away. And then we had the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma and all that stuff. And the reality is, and you can go to NCLS or any other decent historical place and look at this, the fact of the matter is that most people lost their houses due to taxes. Due to taxes. The sheriff did come, that part of the story is true, but the sheriff came, seized the property, sold the property for the back taxes, and then back in those days, the local government kept the money. Oregon had an interesting solution to that after the Great Depression. And we're almost one of the only states that does this, because if you do this today, for example, in Nevada, and you don't pay your taxes by January or February, right, you're going to the sheriff's sale. And of course, without Measure 5 and 50, so on and so forth, I said this in joint tax last year, down in El Paso County in Texas, your taxes can double and then they foreclose on your house 3 months later. And of course, they don't have any fail-safe system either. Oregon did an interesting thing, and I don't know whether it's right or wrong, and we should probably review this, but Oregon decided, no, we're going to do it totally different in the future. And we, after the Great Depression, passed a series of laws that says you cannot foreclose for 3 years. You cannot foreclose on a property for taxes for 3 years. Now, who dreamed up the second half of this that has everything to do with this interest rate? I do not know. But then we said, after 3 years, the county can foreclose on this property, but if the property owner can come up with the money to pay the back taxes, the county has to give it back to them. This is out to the 6-year mark. Now, how bizarre is this? So the county seizes the property at 3 years, sells the property, and then turns around. This is literally happening in one of my counties today, so you know. And then 2 years later, before the 3 years, the people come up with the money in order to pay the back taxes, and now the county has to buy the property back that they sold and give it back to the property owner. This is a modern day 2024 problem happening right now. And so this whole issue of property taxes and interests and how that's spread. Now, what Oregon did one step farther, so you know, is that then what happened was they kind of came up with this idea of, well, they won't be able to pay the property tax because we'll keep the money from the sale. And that's the gray area in Oregon law right now. It's been in and out of the courts. Some courts have said you must give the extra money back to them, in which, of course, wait a minute, you foreclosed the property, sold it, took your property tax, gave the money back to them. They then sent you a check for the old property taxes, and now the county has to buy the property back and give it back to the original owner. This is happening today in Oregon in places. So we have kind of a screwed up system that's here. And then on the opposite side, we have our interest rate system. For those of you who are not aware, if you go to the Department of Revenue, and you could ask them in the back if you wanted to, is they're tied to the IRC, Federal Internal Revenue Code. Good thing. I hear people over here talking about disconnecting from it. I'm with the good Representative Smith thinking this is not a good idea because we need rural economic development, so don't disconnect with it. But that said, they establish basically a prime rate. The IRS establishes a rate. DOR then establishes a rate, and then there's a known rate that goes forward uniformly across the board. And the reason they did that is to prevent usury. Let me say that again, to prevent usury. There are countries in this world that we call the civilized world, members of the United Nations, in which you're not even allowed to charge interest in that country. There are religious denominations that don't allow interest to be charged. And ironically, we have a federal rule, not a law, because this is under the Federal Reserve, that if you're an institution under the Federal Reserve, or I believe under the credit unions, the maximum interest you can charge is 36%. You can't go above that rate regardless. Now, we all know that because we have 3 and 4 jobs for some millennials out there trying to make these house payments, that when they can't make it and they ended up not getting a proper mortgage, because under a normal mortgage in a banking institution, what transpires is your property tax is paid by the bank or the credit union, and then it is added on to the end of your mortgage. But there are a lot of people who don't qualify for what I would say good credit, and so they get to face this property tax issue. So they might need a payday loan. Now, if you're a payday loan company and you are falling under a subsidiary of someone under the Federal Reserve regulations, you don't get to charge outrageous rates. But let me tell you right now, there are a lot, and we can get the number, there are a lot of millennials and younger who are having to get non-payday loan, but special loans, 300%. You all have your iPads and phones, you can type it in there. You need a quick loan from somebody. There are certain entities and institutions across the state that are unregulated that yet by the law, you can borrow money to make your house payment on at 300% interest. Some of them as high as 500% interest. If we're going to fix the housing solution, and if we're going to have to figure out how to go forward economically, and as we said yesterday, oh, it's a lack of having people. We don't have houses for people. I would contend that if we fix the solution, as I mentioned yesterday, when we're only working an average of 33 hours per week, we could address this differently if we did it systematically. This is one step in that. This bill right here basically says, let's establish a reasonable interest rate that these individuals can pay, and a reasonable interest rate that will in turn allow them to afford a mortgage. Because let me go back to how this works so everybody understands again, and why the importance of this discussion right here is that if you couldn't qualify for a good mortgage, and in that case, you're paying the tax bill, or you're a senior citizen who's on a fixed income, whose insurance doubled, whose power has doubled, so on and so forth, you're directly paying for this. This 16 to 17%, you're directly paying for it as you go forward, if you can't make a single payment. So let's just say you got a good mortgage and you were part of the old school, a couple years ago, and your mortgage rate is 6%. The bank is going to pay, based on the bank's convenience, which may or may not include interest, your property taxes. And then it's going to be added on to the end of your mortgage payments, which means if they did not pay it on time, their choice, and that's a cash flow management issue, and I'm not the greatest expert. There's at least one or two of you who know how this financing works, because you don't always pay your property taxes on time because it's more beneficial for your cash flow if you pay it at a different date. If it wasn't paid on time, and the bank or your mortgage institution is paying that rate, you're now borrowing that money at 6% for 30 years. Let me say that again, for 30 years, because it's added to the end of your mortgage. And this is then compounded going forward. This is one of the reasons we have a housing crisis. This is one of the reasons, as I mentioned yesterday, I know 6 or 7 millennials who bought homes, did everything, and the rising costs made them go backwards. What this bill simply asks is to start the discussion or turn around and say, if we're going to lead by the state of Oregon, and we as government are going to lead, then we need to have our stuff in a position that says, this is a reasonable rate, this is a reasonable process, and we're asking you all to follow suit. And when we start doing that, we will start solving the housing crisis. Because just handing out checks to everybody in government and then having programs like this that served a purpose 20, 30, 40 years ago is not a solution. So I urge you to either pass this bill or to bring it into the discussion as we go forward so that we can establish a housing and ownership policy in the state of Oregon that allows people to not only buy homes, but to hold their homes. Thank you, Madam Chair.